The new AMD 800 series chipsets and their accompanying motherboards are officially getting released today. So if you want to buy one, I guess you can now. But should you? What do these new motherboards have to offer? How do they perform? And how much do they cost? Of course, we'll be looking at all of that today, or at least I'll be doing my best to. Stuff like pricing's a bit difficult to get our hands on sort of pre-release. So consider this to be more preview content, sort of kicking off our X870E content. And we'll be doing so with just the flagship model. So I won't be testing all of these models in today's video, but I will be getting to all of the X870 motherboards from Asus, Asrock, Gigabyte, and MSI. Actually, that's not entirely true. We don't have MSI's most premium board, the Godlike, and we also don't have the Extreme board from Gigabyte. So we'll have to make do with MSI's Carbon and the Aorus Master from Gigabyte. But anyway, before we get into the boards, I suppose we should talk about what the difference is between the new X870E and the old X670E chipsets. The answer is bugger all, really. They're essentially the exact same thing. X870E just makes the inclusion of USB 4 support mandatory. Other than that, though, they're the same. So there are two chipsets providing a maximum of 44 PCIe lanes, 24 of which will support PCIe 5.0. The primary PCIe slot from the CPU has to be 5.0 compliant, as does the primary M.2 connector to the CPU. Then the maximum USB support is 40 gigabits per second, which is also a requirement as this is mandatory USB 4 support. Now, the difference between X870 and X670, so the non-E versions, that's more substantial. X870 requires the primary PCIe slot to be 5.0 compliant, and again does require USB 4 support. But it only uses a single chipset, whereas X670 requires two, meaning there are just 36 PCIe lanes available for X870, but 44 lanes for X670. So the newer X870 is a downgrade in that sense. But there are now 24 PCIe 5.0 lanes for X870, whereas the older X670 had just 8. So it's a bit of an odd choice there by AMD that makes their already confusing chipset lineup even more confusing. Anyway, the models that we're looking at today are all X870E boards, and they all cost way too much money. So that's exciting. But anyway, let's check them out. We'll start with the MSI MPG X870E Carbon Wi-Fi, which is the most high-end MSI X870E board we have, given the current absence of the Godlike. MSI claims an MSRP of $500 US for this board, so it isn't cheap, but expect this to be the norm for X870E boards. Of course, we are yet to see where the retail price settles in, but as it stands, the X670E Carbon retails for $420 US, and it lacks features such as Wi-Fi 7, 5 gigabit LAN, and USB 4, for example. There are also some nice board features on offer here as well, such as easy PCIe release for the primary PCIe slot. There's also easy M.2 Shield Frozer 2, which is a toolless design that still allows for RGB lighting on the heatsink, which is of course very necessary, but it does look pretty cool. No pun intended. In fact, all the M.2 slots are tool-free on the X870E Carbon, and that's not necessarily a feature you'll find on all of these really expensive X870E motherboards. The other three M.2s can all be accessed at the same time by removing a single large heatsink, using the same tool-free release mechanism, and both sides of the SSDs are cooled. The primary and secondary M.2s are both PCIe 5.0 compliant, while the other two are PCIe 4.0. Other neat onboard features include a digital debug LED, power and reset buttons, along with massive VRM heatsinks. Speaking of the VRM, you're getting 18 110 amp power stages just for the V-Core. So that's a bit insane. The X670E version, for example, that was already pretty overkill with 18 90 amp power stages. So of course, you'd naturally just go and upgrade those. Makes sense. Overall though, the X870E Carbon Wi-Fi is a really good looking AM5 motherboard, and at $500 US, it'd want to be. Next up, we have the Asus ROG Crosshair X870E Hero, which is one of the best looking motherboards I've ever seen. And best of all, it's loaded with features, so much so that it's really hard to work out where you should begin. The feature list is almost overwhelming. Stuff like M.2 Q release, PCIe slot Q release slim, Q antenna, QLED, Q code. In other words, there's a lot of Q stuff, along with Wi-Fi 7, boatloads of PCIe 5.0 M.2s, Nitro Path DRAM technology, built-in clock generator, and now we've just started to scratch the surface. And no, I don't mean the surface of that massive RGB holographic panel. Now, around at the I/O panel, you'll find 2 USB 4 ports, 8 USB 10 gigabits per second ports, half a dozen Type A with 2 Type C ports, an HDMI output, Wi-Fi module, 2 Ethernet ports, one 2.5 gigabit and the other 5 gigabit, gold-plated audio jacks, optical audio out, BIOS flashback button, and a clear CMOS button. It's a well-stocked I/O panel with loads of USB support, and not a single USB 2.0 port in sight, which I love to see on a high-end motherboard. In terms of cooling, the Crosshair X870E Hero is a slab of aluminium. The backside of the board features a full-size heat spreader, while the front side there's a series of massive VRM heatsinks, along with multiple M.2 heatsinks which also cover the chipsets. There are 5 M.2 slots on board. The first 3 support PCIe 5.0, while the additional 2 are 4.0 compliant. The PCIe 5.0 ports offer cooling for both sides of the SSD, and the primary port, which is connected to the CPU, gets a large heatsink featuring the M.2 Q release feature, which also incorporates Q slide and Q latch, a triple Q feature there if you will. Both PCIe x16 slots also feature the new Q release slim feature, which is a retention mechanism that doesn't require you to push any button for release. Simply lift the graphics card out towards the I/O end and it'll automatically release. As for the VRM, like MSI's X870E Carbon Wi-Fi, this board has enough power delivery for half a dozen Intel Core i9 14900K processors, which is a little bit insane as it only has to power at most a single Ryzen 9 9950X. So, needless to say, there's oodles of headroom here thanks to 18 110 amp power stages just for the V-Core. There's really not much point in testing the VRM thermal performance of this VRM, but of course we'll do it anyway. The Asrock X870E Taichi should be the most affordable flagship X870E motherboard, and despite that, I've got to say it still looks quite impressive. That said, those gold highlights won't be for everyone, and if so, the Taichi Lite might be more your cup of tea, and we'll take a look at that version in a moment. Around at the I/O panel, you'll find a dozen USB ports, though there are a pair of USB 2.0 ports and then 3 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports. So, not the most stacked USB configuration, but you'll still find 5 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports along with those 2 USB 4 ports. There's also a LAN port, Wi-Fi antenna ports, optical audio out, 2 audio jacks, CMOS clear button, and a BIOS flashback button. On board, you'll find 4 M.2 ports, a single PCIe 5.0 port connected to the CPU, and then 3 PCIe 4.0 ports. There's also 2 PCIe 5.0x16 slots, both connected to the CPU, and when both are in use, they will run at a x8/x8 configuration. There's also a power and reset button on board, along with a digital diagnostic LED display. There's also an easy release for the primary PCIe x16 slot, and toolless access for the primary and secondary M.2s, though you will have to remove a few screws to access the additional M.2s. Covering the VRM are massive heatsinks connected using a heat pipe, and despite this, Asrock has still included a small active fan, though we couldn't hear the fan in our testing. They've really gone for extreme overkill here, given the V-Core VRM consists of 24 110 amp power stages. That's enough power delivery for the latest 64-core Threadripper CPU, but sure, chuck it on a desktop board, I guess. And if the gold highlights really aren't your thing, there is the Taichi Lite, which is a more tasteful looking board in my opinion, and other than the more toned down appearance, The Taichi and Taichi Lite are the exact same motherboard. The Lite version will save you $50 at an MSRP of $400 US, so a pretty spectacular high-end board for that money, I'd say. Personally, this is the version I'd be getting. I can do away with stuff like easy PCIe connectors, especially given that important features such as the onboard debug LED remain. And then last up, we have the Gigabyte X870E Aorus Master, which is, as you'd expect, a more refined version of the X670E Master. It's also not the most high-end X870E board that you'll see from Gigabyte. That would be the Aorus Extreme AI Top. Horrible name there with the cringy AI Top added to the end there, but at $800 US, it is certainly an extreme motherboard. Anyway, for now, we will have to settle with the Aorus Master. Around at the rear I/O, you'll find when compared to the previous model, it now includes a clear CMOS button, along with a better button for the Q Flash feature. The Wi-Fi antenna connections have also been upgraded to the new Easy Plug. In terms of USB support, the only real change here is the inclusion of USB 4, and of course there are 2 ports. Other than that though, you're still getting 4 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, along with 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, and a pair of USB 2.0 ports. So what's here in terms of USB support is a little bit disappointing, as cheaper models such as MSI's X870E Carbon Wi-Fi easily have the Aorus Master beat. The onboard features are decent. You get a digital debug LED display along with debug LEDs. There's a power button, quick release for the primary PCIe x16 slot, and tool-free access to the M.2s, though the swivel latches are a little more difficult to use when compared to the press button approach used by MSI. That said, reattaching the heatsinks is super quick and easy, and it's just the removal that's a little bit trickier, but I don't mean to make it sound difficult, as it is still very easy. You're also getting real finned heatsinks over the VRM, and powering the V-Core, we find 16 110 amp power stages, which is a similar configuration to that of the original, which used 16 105 amp power stages, and that was extreme overkill. In total, there are 3 PCIe x16 expansion slots, and the primary is wired for PCIe 5.0 x 16 bandwidth, while the second is PCIe 4.0 x 4 bandwidth, and the third PCIe 3.0 x 4 bandwidth. There are 4 M.2 slots in total, 3 supporting PCIe 5.0, and a 4th limited to PCIe 4.0. Overall, it is a good looking board, and now it's time to see how it performs along with the other boards that we just looked at. For testing, I'm using the Antec Flux Pro mid-tower case, and for recording temperatures, I'm using a digital thermometer with K-type thermocouples, and I'm reporting the peak PCB temperature. Finally, I'm not reporting delta T over ambient, instead I maintain a room temperature of 21 degrees, and to ensure a consistent ambient temperature, a thermocouple is positioned next to the test system. As for the stress test, I'm using the Ryzen 9 9950X, and for load Cinebench 2024, which was looped for an hour, at which point I'm reporting the maximum PCB temperature, again recorded using K-type thermocouples. Okay, let's get into the results. As you'd expect, all 4 boards ran very cool, well under 70 degrees for all 4 models. The best performer here was the Asrock X870E Taichi, and I found the same 52 degree peak hotspot temperature for both the standard and light models. That said, Asrock also consumed the least amount of power on the 12 volt rails, 5% less than Asus and 8% less than MSI, though overall performance deviated by no more than 1%. Surprisingly, the Aorus Master ran the hottest, though it did so at what really is a cool 62 degrees. But with a score of 2,289 points, it was the fastest board, if only by a very slim margin. In short, all boards passed this test with ease. VRM Thermals are not a concern for any of these boards, which is exactly what we expected to find leading into this testing. And just quickly, here's a look at the peak chipset temperature reported by each board after our hour-long stress test. Temperatures range between 52 and 57 degrees, so only a very small variance here, and all temperatures were well within safe limits. Now here's a look at overclocking memory support, and for this testing I was using G-Skill's Trident Z5 Neo DDR5 8000 CL38 kit, and first and foremost I just wanted to see if we could simply load the EXPO profile and have the system work as it should. So a stable DDR5 8000 configuration, and by stable I mean a 1 hour pass of Prime 95 large FFTs. So admittedly not the most vigorous validation, but it already takes an entire day to test just a single motherboard, so we can't really throw much more time at it. Anyway, the findings are as follows. All boards passed with the exception of Asrock's Taichis, both of which failed to even post with the 8000 EXPO profile loaded. Now I should note all boards were running the latest BIOS revisions available at the time of testing, which were based on a GSA 1.2.0.2, and Asrock had no further updates for us. Asrock has validated these boards to run at over 8000 speeds, so it's either a compatibility issue with our RAM kit, which they can address with a future BIOS update I suppose, or perhaps something else is going on. So we're not saying you can't run DDR5 8000 on the X870E Taichi, but we are saying that the kit we have just wouldn't work. It cannot post at this point in time. We could get it to post if we manually set the memory speed to 7800, but it did fail the Prime 95 test, forcing us down to DDR5 7400 for stability. Now, for the maximum frequency testing, the voltage was left at 1.4 volt, and the primary, secondary, and tertiary memory timings were manually locked in at the EXPO default values. I then raised the memory frequency, ran our hour-long stress test, and if it crashed within the hour, the frequency was reduced, and if it passed, the frequency was raised until it crashed. This resulted in a maximum stable memory frequency of 8200 for the Gigabyte boards, 8100 for MSI, and an impressive 8300 for Asus. Keep in mind this data is based on a sample size of 1 for literally everything, the CPU, the memory kit, and the motherboard, but using the hardware that we have, these are the frequencies that we were able to validate. Now another memory-related test is Error Correction Code or ECC Memory Support, and this is something a few of you have asked us to look at when testing motherboards, for platforms that do support ECC of course. With AM5, ECC is supported, but it's an optional feature, and as I found, some boards will support it while others won't. The Gigabyte and Asrock boards both worked correctly with ECC enabled, and we could even overclock the 5600 memory to 6400 using the stock timings and voltages. Now the Asus board ran with ECC memory, in the sense that it passed the power on self test and could even overclock the memory to 6400, but ECC wasn't actually enabled. Then with the MSI board, it wouldn't even post with the ECC memory installed. We tried one stick, different DIMMs, but with the current BIOS, this memory kit isn't supported. I did reach out to MSI about this, and they said MSI does not test or validate consumer range motherboards with ECC memory. So in short, if you want ECC memory support on an AM5 desktop motherboard, don't buy an MSI board. Now, a test that's always highly requested is boot times. Personally, I really don't care about boot times as long as they're within reason, but I know a lot of you do care, so here's the data. The slowest boards took 23 seconds from power on to the time they hit the Windows 11 desktop. All 4 Windows 11 installs were fresh. They did have quite a bit of software installed for testing, but everything was removed from startup. So this is essentially a clean install with little to no bloat on startup. Although MSI, Asus, and Asrock were all around the 22 to 23 second mark, Gigabyte somehow managed to boot in 17 seconds. And these figures are based on a 3-run average. So Gigabyte wins here, saving you 5 to 6 seconds every time you turn your PC on, for whatever that's worth. Now for a look at rear I/O USB performance, just to make sure everything is working as it should, and for this I used the new Ugreen USB 4 M.2 NVMe SSD enclosure with a PCIe 5.0 SSD. This enclosure is said to support the full USB 4 40 gigabits per second transfer speed, and with the crucial T700 1TB SSD, we should be able to max it out, at least when reading from an external SSD. For this test, I've created a RAM drive, and we are copying a large file from the external USB 4 drive to the RAM drive. And using custom-made software, we can record the exact time this transfer takes, as well as the sustained transfer speed. I will be showing a visual of the rear I/O and highlighting each port tested with the transfer speed from a 3-run average. Please note, some ports are grouped as they performed within a few megabytes of each other. The Asrock Taichi models include 3 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, and these ports are limited to around 430 megabytes per second, and unfortunately, there are 2 USB 2 ports, which are obviously very slow at 40 megabytes per second. Now, there are 5 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, but we could only push over 1 gigabytes per second on 4 of them, with 5 capped out at just shy of 950 megabytes per second. I'm not sure why that is, but this was highly repeatable. Finally, we have the USB 4 ports, and in our test we maxed out at 4 gigabytes per second. Theoretically, they should be faster, but for our configuration, 4 gigabytes per second was the limit, and we saw this across all 4 boards. Asus also do away with USB 2.0 on the rear I/O, which is really nice to see, and they've even banished USB 3.2 Gen 1, making USB 3.2 Gen 2 the slowest interface you can expect to find. Again, I found some Gen 2 ports limited to 950 megabytes per second, while others would go above 1 gigabytes per second. Not a huge difference, but it is interesting to note. Then we have the USB 4 ports, which again were good for 4 gigabytes per second. Gigabyte, like Asrock, includes a range of USB standards on the rear I/O, including USB 2.0, USB 3.2 Gen 1 and Gen 2, along with USB 4. So while it's nice to have a dozen ports to pick from, it's a bit annoying how slow some of them are on such an expensive motherboard. Then finally we have MSI, who have a similar configuration to Asus, so that means all ports are capable of more than 900 megabytes per second, and with 13 ports in total, that is mighty impressive. Again, we did see around an 8% variance in performance for the USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports. Some ports are certainly faster than others, but overall, a great configuration here. Now, I can't recall the last time I actually used onboard audio, but this is one aspect of the motherboard some of you wanted to see tested, so here's the data. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of it. If you care about this stuff, we're providing the data as an experiment, and we might continue to do so in the future. For this testing, I'm using the Rightmark Audio Analyzer software, which requires you to connect the line out to the line in using a short 3.5mm to 3.5mm high quality jack. The OS speaker is set to 100%, and the line in is adjusted until the software is happy with the levels. This test looks at a number of things, including noise levels, range, harmonic distortion, and stereo crosstalk, for example. All of the boards here tested quite well, though the Asus Crosshair Hero was the standout. So there you have it, our first look at the new AMD X870E motherboards, and yeah, apologies, I said X870E or X670E, too much in this video, but yeah, it's kind of unavoidable. Anyway, if you're wondering why we didn't include any gaming benchmarks comparing the X870E and X670E chipsets, for example, or motherboards, it's because of the same thing. There's no performance improvements at all to be had with X870E. I'm sure AMD will try and push stuff like DDR5 8000 support, but this really isn't anything new. Decent 600 series boards already supported DDR5 8000. It's just not worth using as performance is similar to DDR5 6000, so don't waste your money on expensive 8000 memory. The only real advantage of these 800 series boards is the USB 4 support, but of course there were already 600 series boards with USB 4. The Asrock B650E Taichi Lite, as one example, included a single USB 4 port for just $240 US, while the X670E Taichi offers a pair of USB 4 ports for $380 US. Still, if you're in the market for a high-end X670E board, these new X870E models should be of interest. Take the MSI MPG Carbon Wi-Fi, for example. The X670E version currently costs $420 US, which means the X870E version should come in at an almost 20% premium if the $500 US MSRP is correct. The new X870E model, though, is considerably better. Not only are you getting more USB ports on the rear I/O, you're getting many more high-speed ports with 13 at 10 gigabits per second or better compared to just 8 on the X670E model. And of course, you also get USB 4, which is completely absent on that previous model. The Wi-Fi 6E has also been upgraded to Wi-Fi 7, and the wired LAN has been upgraded to 5 gigabit while still keeping the 2.5 gigabit connection. As for which of these 4 models is the best, or I suppose 5 models given there are 2 Taichis, it is hard to say given we're yet to see the retail pricing of these boards, and Asus couldn't even give us an MSRP for the ROG Crosshair X870E Hero. So while the Asus board is super impressive, if it costs $700 US, I'm a lot less interested in it. Anyway, as I said, consider this to be our preview look at these high-end X870E motherboards. Hopefully soon I will have a full breakdown on all the boards that you see here, plus many more in a single video. So that should be pretty handy. But until then, do let me know what you think about these new motherboards and how necessary you find them, or some of them are offering some pretty great upgrades or decent upgrades. Anyway, as I said, let me know what you think about them and whether or not you're considering buying an 800 series motherboard. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. As I said, a huge amount of work is going to go into all of this testing, but more than happy to do it for you guys because I know a lot of you really do enjoy this content, or at least appreciate it. We have the join button for YouTube, Patreon if you want to get access to our exclusive Discord server where you can make various requests of what you'd like us to test with motherboards. A lot of the guys in the Discord server do like to do that, and a lot of this testing has come about because of them. Behind the scenes content, there's Q&A stuff, and I don't know. There's some cool perks there. Check it out if you're interested, but if not, that is perfectly fine. And of course, I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.